All right, hello and welcome back to our part 4 of our strategic planning webinar series, looking at logic models and realistic planning for Missouri Partners in Prevention. In case you happen to forget, this is Kathleen Ratcliff with Upstream Prevention, a nonprofit based in Indiana. So let's go ahead and get started. We're recapping and expanding a little bit on the December 2018 PIP meeting that you all had. So with a little bit of modifications, but our first webinar in our series talked about kind of Prevention 101, outlining some of those basics, getting you started with a couple of activities of brainstorming to then use that data working through this process. Our second webinar focused on that theory of change and focusing on the whys and those underlying factors that exist for our problem behaviors, and then challenging us to make sure that the strategies we're selecting actually address those whys. The third one that you ideally have watched looked at your statewide data, the statewide kind of benchmarks and strategies, and encouraged you to look at your local data and how those aligned with those statewide benchmark and strategies. And then this one, we're going to take kind of everything that we've talked about and start to put it into some sort of a format where we can look at our theory of change, look at our strategies, and put it together in a logical manner, but then also encouraging you to think about your planning process moving forward. So first, we've got our logic models. So when we think about logic models, if you know anything about logic models, you know that those are a little bit scary sometimes, maybe. I personally love them. A lot of people I know don't. But really, when we think about logic models, we're thinking about answering that question, why? So coming back to that theory of change, we're asking ourselves, why is this not necessarily a problem, but why is this problem happening? And then what can I do to address it? So we're digging deeper into that why that we asked in the second webinar, and including that but why that we have there as well, and as many but whys as we can come up with. But again, thinking about a logic model, we're essentially just trying to take that theory of change that we've already established and that alignment that we've already established and putting it into a graphical representation that we can then see at a glance and a snapshot. So as an example, a very, very simple logic model, and this is what we'll be working with for this webinar, is looking at identifying those problems and related behaviors on the far left, matching those to the underlying factors that relate to them, and matching that to the strategy. I encourage you, if you were building logic models, it may get a little tedious or may seem a little tedious, but for each of these items, you want to make sure that comprehensively they make sense. So I may have identified 3 or 4 different problems. For each of those 3 or 4 problems, I may have maybe 2 underlying factors. And for each of those underlying factors, I may have 1 or 2 strategies, right? But for each of those kind of deviations or each of those branches, I should have things that align. So I want to make sure, and we'll talk about this more in just a second, and I'll clarify. I want to make sure that my boxes make sense holistically from left to right and from right to left. So if I've got 2 separate problems in my single box, if I maybe have suicide ideation and underage drinking, those are both fine to have as problems to focus on and behaviors to focus on. But they may have some similar underlying factors, but they probably have different strategies, and they probably have some different underlying factors. So for each problem I identify and each underlying factor that I identify, if it is not the exact same, we need to have separate boxes lined up under it. Because again, we're thinking here about that conceptual fit. Will the interventions, again, thinking right to left, will my intervention impact that underlying factor? And if there are more than one underlying factor and the strategy doesn't address all of those, then I need essentially a new row. And then thinking again, continuing to move, does it address the problem? So does it address the problem? Does it address the underlying factors and the conditions associated with it? And does it target a relevant population and or context? We see this a lot, and I think Joan shared a really great example. We may identify some of these subpopulations on our campus as ones to work with, and then when we address them and target them for interactions and for strategies, we can maybe see them shift. But if we target a big, broad problem on our campus, or use our entire campus data to target a population or to target a problem behavior, and then we only reach out to a subpopulation, we're probably going to see change, or ideally we'll see change in that subpopulation, but it may not be big enough to move our campus overall. And so again, as we're thinking about our problems, those underlying factors and that strategy to then address those items, making sure that we are thinking also about the population or the target that we will be reaching out to. So it's perfectly fine to utilize full campus data or subpopulation data, either one, just making sure that wherever that strategy is being implemented, it's addressing those underlying factors and the problems, related problems at that population level. So again, if we think about this simple logic model, we've got our same 3 boxes up top. So I have my problem in this example is that 56% of students don't always use a designated driver. So this is from the mock B. It's asking about the frequency that they use a designated driver. One of the response options is always. And so this is the portion that doesn't say always. And so if we think about some of those underlying factors, if we think about some of those whys, we might think that we may come up with many underlying factors. We may think about the fact that sometimes individuals go out and are at bars and they want to have a drink in their hand so that they can fit in. So we hear this common and frequently in terms of they maybe weren't planning on drinking and they were supposed to be the designated driver, but they ended up consuming alcohol because everybody else was drinking. And so if we want them to still be designated drivers and still not consume any alcohol, but they're wanting to drink something so that they fit in, Cheers to the designated driver is a perfect strategy for that in the bars or in the restaurants, where Cheers is providing non-alcoholic drinks to designated drivers free of charge. So if my designated driver tends to drink because they need something in their hands to consume, let's put a Coke in there or Pepsi or whatever. So we can see how this alignment could work and could make sense, both right to left and left to right. However, if our underlying factors was that our designated drivers felt like they could drive after one drink, or because our students didn't plan ahead to identify a designated driver, that Cheers program probably isn't going to be the best. But for the underlying factor that I have there, we can identify that Cheers alignment. So what I want you to do is start to think about building your own. So there is a blank sheet that you can download with this webinar, Logic Model Draft. And what I want you to do, you can do it on the worksheet or you can do it separate, is I want you to, again, identify one of your key factors or your key problems that you identified and have been working with. List out those underlying factors that we've already identified, and then think about what strategies make sense for those underlying factors. I encourage you to not put your underlying factors all in one box unless you have a strategy that addresses all of those, but more than likely you're going to have multiple underlying factors and then either multiple strategies to address those underlying factors or a strategy that you're targeting one or more of those underlying factors. We also know that there are many, many reasons and many, many of those whys, and not all of those whys apply to every student. So we may need to think about which one can we get the most bang for our buck. So we know that many times, or at least a risk factor for substance use is a low perception of harm. So if I am 20 years old, I'm invincible, nothing's going to hurt me, I can have 20 beers and I'm perfectly fine. So that underlying factor there would be a low perception of harm, that feeling of invincibility, right? We know that if we address perception of harm, we can see changes in not only alcohol use or a single substance use, but we can see it across the board depending on what that strategy is. So perception of harm might be an easier target, might be an easier underlying factor that relates to our problem behavior of use based off of the strategies that exist to address it. So I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and pause the webinar, look at that sheet or look at your things that you have identified so far and kind of put them in this order. So what are your problems and related behaviors on the left, your underlying factors in the middle, and then the strategies that align to those items. Again, feeling free to have as many of these kind of sets of 3 boxes as you need so that they all make sense across. All right, and so as you're working through, let me back up a second. As you're working through these and building your logic models, again, I encourage you to think about asking yourself those if-then statements. So if I implement this strategy, then this underlying factor will change. And if this underlying factor will change, then this problem behavior will change. If it doesn't make sense, if it's not quite connecting and not quite clicking, you probably have a problem with your theory of change. Again, these are also things that you can look at and focus on in terms of with the PIP staff or with your coalition in order to make them as strong as possible. All right, so as you get your logic models identified, and again, as you start to think about trying to do this more holistically, the next thing to do is to make sure that you have the ability or have the plan thought out as to how to go about implementing some of these, right, or addressing some of these. So as a Partners in Prevention campus, if you are PIP campus, you are required to complete a strategic plan every year. And I know that many of you spend the time and are able to sit down with a coalition and think about where have we been, where are we wanting to go, what do we need to update, what new strategies should we add in, or what should we maybe stop. But I would also bet that there's probably a fair amount of us that get pushed up against the deadline because we've got too much work and not enough staff. And our strategic plan update is looking at these things have been going well, let's keep doing them. Here's an update to our numbers, let's continue. So as we're moving forward, or as PIP is trying to push you forward and encourage you to grow and improve, this is something that we're hoping you might be able to move away from and instead critically think about each of the strategies you're doing, thinking about why you're doing them and what problems and what underlying risk factors and protective factors they're addressing. So to do this, you've got to work through, again, kind of those past 3.5 webinars, right? Getting to our logic models. And once we've gotten a strong identification of what some of those strategies are, then we can start to build our action plan for the year. So this process that we're going to talk through and that I'm going to encourage you to do ideally right now and then a little bit broader or again with your coalition is something that you can use when you're building that action plan. But instead of that, instead of trying to get you to that point right now, we're instead going to think about how to build an action plan or encouraging you to build an action plan for updating your action plan. So how can I create a game plan for my strategic planning process? So how can I, and by I mean you, how can you work yourself through a process that's realistic and feasible for you and your campus in order to improve and get a stronger strategic plan moving forward? And so the first thing I want you to do, ideally on multiple sheets of paper, so if you've got Post-its, that would be handy. If not, you can write it down on a sheet of paper, just break it up with lots of space. I want you to brainstorm what you need to do starting today or starting tomorrow, all of the things, all of them in order or not in order. What are all of the things that you would need to do in order to get to a stronger strategic plan? So you're probably going to want to pause the webinar because I'm not going to wait long enough for you to complete all of those. But you might think about, do you need to gather updated data? Do you need to identify a key group of people? Is it something as simple as blocking off, time every week? What are those, as tiny as they are, or maybe, what are all of those steps that need to be done in order for you to get to feeling like you have a confident strategic plan? So I'm going to pause. You should go ahead and pause and brainstorm what all of those steps are. Again, on separate pieces of paper if you can, or if not, at least on things that maybe we can separate out. All right, and now that you've ideally got your steps done, if you did it all on one sheet of paper, I do encourage you to go ahead and pause and kind of cut those sheets of paper apart, ideally getting to the point where you have all of the steps, all of the little things separated out onto individual sheets. Again, if you use Post-its, you're probably already done if you put one item per Post-it. Part of this is that this brainstorming, I assume most of you are probably doing solo in your office, but this is also a really good activity to take to a small core group because inevitably in this situation, as we're building plans, more heads are better than one, and somebody probably identified something that somebody else forgot. So the more of these we can have, and again, they're probably going to have some duplicates, so we can then weed those out, but having them on individual sheets of paper allows us to shuffle them around. So that was that writing on squares. So if you've done this with a group, this is where you can then start to think about what are the duplicates that we need to remove, what are the items that maybe somebody forgot that we need to make sure we include, and then I want you to take those squares or those Post-its or those sheets of paper and start to organize them sequentially. So this is where it's nice to have them on separate sheets of paper. If you're anything like me, you make a to-do list and inevitably the things that are super important end up at the top, but you get about halfway through and then you realize something that's like your highest priority, right? So we're trying to avoid that by having them on separate sheets of paper. We can then shuffle them around and put them in order. So think about, of all of the steps listed, all of the squares you have in front of you or your group has in front of you, what has to be done first? And is there a first step? Is there something you need to maybe add as a first step? And think about what comes next and next and next in order to get me to the outcome that I'm aiming for, or the goal that I'm aiming for. And then also maybe write down that goal, because it's also completely possible that you didn't get all the way to that point. Having a fully completed, updated, strong strategic plan, that could be a good outcome. So go ahead and organize these squares sequentially. And then there are some that maybe don't have to happen in a sequential order, but have to happen at some time. You can either pull those out or you can put those maybe where the effort might start. You need to pause the webinar, you can pause the webinar, but otherwise we are going to keep going, because we're going to talk about building a Gantt chart. So for those of you who aren't familiar with a Gantt chart, this is a chart that depicts progress in relationship to the time of projects or tasks or schedules. So it's kind of like building a long-term to-do list that identifies when you should be starting and finishing things. So as an example, as I was prepping for this webinar, as I was prepping for this training that I gave in December, we started in September, and so this could be an example of the Gantt chart. This one's a little bit faulty because this is created after the fact. So this is an idea of what this could look like. So the week of September 24th, I started brainstorming ideas. I had a call with Joan and Margot to discuss what they needed or what they wanted and what I thought should be covered. And so I had that call the week of September 24th. I built a proposal the week of the 1st of October. I started to review your all's strategic plans the week of the 8th of October. And then I got a little bit busy. So you can see those next 3 weeks, there's nothing there. I continued to review plans the weeks of November 5th, 12th, and 19th. And I started to build that presentation that I gave in December around the week of November 12th. So I started building it based off of my things that came ahead of it. So you can see those yellow highlights. Those are identifying, in this case, the weeks that those activities occurred. If I were to build this prospectively, if it was, maybe the 1st of September and I was building this, I would probably have moved my November 5th, 12th, and 19th reviewing of plans into those 3 weeks that there wasn't much, and probably bumped my presentation up a week. If I was thinking about how to plan ahead, I would identify, here's what I need to do first. I need to brainstorm and have a call, build my proposal, start to review things, and then build my presentation. The process is the same. If I did this prospectively, it would look a little bit different in terms of not having that gap. But I could have also thought to myself that October 15th, that's right around my husband's birthday, and we were taking a trip to Mexico for it, so I'm not going to get much work done that week. I also have midterms. I'm a teacher at a university, so I've got midterms to grade and that type of thing, so probably am not going to get much done that week of October 22nd. And then the 29th, I'm probably catching up from the past 2 weeks, right? So I could have also planned that I'm going to have this outage, or that this is a really busy time and I'm not going to get work done on this. So what I am hopeful that you all will do is start to look at those activities and those tasks and steps that you've identified, and start to put those, again, into order, and then think about what is the time constraint, or how long, or when do you think you could actually achieve this. So there is a template, a download that you can download with this webinar that is a kind of a sample Gantt chart, but it may not work the best for you. So the one that you can download is set up for a monthly view. For those of you who were there in December, it is the same thing that you had there. You can see it started in December, runs all the way through September in that monthly view. That was set up to follow the December training and end at the time where your strategic plans were due. However, depending on when you're looking at this, it may be March or April, maybe even May. You may want to, instead of using my template, build your own in, Excel or in Word. And again, doing it as detailed or as explicit in terms of small steps and big steps as possible, but then making sure that your headings across. So where I have on this version the weeks, so it's the week of September 24th, and the download that you can download, it's a month. Putting that time frame in whatever format is best for you. So maybe it's a weekly format, maybe it's a bi-weekly format. You could get really super detailed and maybe do daily formats. But think about, for each of those steps that you've identified, when should that step start? So when does my my box get highlighted, and when does it end? Where does my highlight end? And think about prioritizing or organizing your steps in that format. The other really great thing about a Gantt chart, or at least a super simple Gantt chart like this one, is that those tasks and activities that maybe don't fall sequentially are great ones that you can then plug in where you feel like you might have the ability to tackle them. So maybe if I knew that I had October 15th, 22nd, and 29th, those 3 weeks, if I knew that I wasn't going to get a lot of work done, but maybe I had a coworker who would be able to pick up and do some things, I could put in a task that doesn't have to happen at any given time, but we could put it in those 3 weeks so that that momentum is still happening. So for those that aren't sequentially required, you have that ability to plug them in, maybe where you feel like your work or your progress on this is a little light, or maybe where you need an easy win for a pick-me-up, or those types of things. If you've used Gantt charts before, you may have a different setup or system that you like to use, which is perfectly fine to do. If you've never used Gantt charts before, this is a very simplistic way that you can start to tackle those and put those in. Again, I think it's a really nice visual to be able to plan, again, realistically, because you're setting up the plan for yourself, but to be able to visualize and plan where things are. The other benefit, if you build it in Excel, you can print it off, put it at your desk, and you can always go in and adjust it if you need to. So when a crisis or something pops up and you have to push everything back a week, you have that ability to modify it. And again, give yourself grace if you need to adjust. So with that, as kind of that look back, we had our first webinar talking about Prevention 101. We focused then on our theory of change and our campus alignment with the state. And then ideally, after this webinar, you've started to build your logic models, again, with individual logic models for each of those different underlying factors that have different strategies with them, and then started to think about how you can realistically plan, and the example that we gave was building a Gantt chart, but how can you realistically plan to get from where you are today to a stronger, more comprehensive, more logical or connected strategic plan. Throughout this, if you've had any questions, hopefully you've reached out to the PIP staff. If you haven't, they're great people. You should do that. It is their role, and they would be happy to help you think through each of these sections, provide additional resources if you need additional resources, and support you as you're trying to help your campus move forward. And with that, I thank you so much for participating in our webinar series. Hopefully it has been useful, and that is something that you can view and share with your campus coalition and work through this process that we work through with individual items more holistically. Thank you.